Throughout the 1930s, really beginning in 1933 when Hitler came to power formally in Germany and Mussolini was well entrenched in his power in Italy, these two fascist countries embarked on a series of events that were really quite aggressive and paved the way for Europe to become embroiled in World War II. And so over the course of 6 years, there's a series of increasingly aggressive behaviors, mainly by Germany, but also by the Italians, the fascist powers. And the Western democracies, England and France primarily, and the United States, played a role in excusing, justifying, or in some other ways just kind of turning away from these acts, not really seeing them for what they were, remaining hopeful that the world could remain at peace. The first act of fascist aggression of the 1930s was the 1933 invasion of Ethiopia, by the Italians. You might recall, or you might not, from our study of the new imperialism that Ethiopia, which was formerly called Abyssinia, remained independent in Africa. It was never colonized. And the reason for that was because the Italians had tried to invade and colonize Abyssinia, also known as Ethiopia, in the late 19th century and had failed. They had been defeated by the Ethiopian army, and subsequently no European power tried to colonize them. So it remained one of two African nations that remained independent. Well, in 1933, Mussolini decided that they were going to go for it again, and this time the Italians were quite successful at conquering, for all practical purposes, Ethiopia. Now, in our modern understanding of Ethiopia, we think of a plague, or not plague, but like a famine-plagued country that's kind of backwards and has a lot of political dysfunction and a lot of poverty. Ethiopia in the 1930s was not like that. It was really quite a vibrant country. This is the Prince of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. I love his name. And it was economically and politically stable. And while by no means was it advanced socially or technologically to the level of the Europeans, so that this was a country that was on its own feet and was stable and was doing quite well. And so Haile Selassie appealed to the international community upon this invasion of his country by the Italians. He appealed to the international community, most notably to the League of Nations, for help. And what he got was nothing. What he got was a lot of denunciations and condemnation of the Italians, as in, yeah, that was not cool. They should not have done that. But he didn't get any help. Nobody was willing to take action. The invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians in 1933 really illustrated the futility of the League of Nations, this international body which had been the dream of President Wilson at the meeting at Versailles, where they formed the Treaty of Versailles, did not ever include the United States. The Americans never joined, and following World War I, the United States really was the only country with the economic and political clout to be a leading member of an organization like this. But the United States did not like its role on the world stage that it felt it was thrust into by the First World War and its participation in the First World War. Americans, and consequently the American government, had really shunned this new role, and the Americans had never joined the League of Nations. In fact, if you will recall, the League of Nations is exactly why the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And so Haile Selassie had appealed very eloquently to the League of Nations for help, and here is a strong moment, a good moment for the world to effectively condemn Italy and to reverse this action, and they failed to take action. And this cartoon, as you can see here, the gap in the bridge. The United States is the keystone of this bridge called the League of Nations, and a bridge won't hold without its keystone. An archway won't hold without its keystone. And the League of Nations simply was not going to work without the participation of the United States. So here was the big moment for the League of Nations to prove what President Wilson, that it could do, what President Wilson and others hoped it could do, envisioned it doing, and it failed pretty spectacularly. The Treaty of Versailles established an area of Germany called the Rhineland as a demilitarized zone between France and Germany. If you will remember from earlier in this unit, the Rhineland, which was a territory on the border of France and Germany, was a buffer zone, a demilitarized zone. So the Germans were not supposed to have any military fortifications or bases or soldiers in the Rhineland. And the Treaty of Versailles expressly dictated this. And in 1936, Hitler reclaimed the Rhineland. You can see here he's marching his troops back into the Rhineland. This was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And you can see the people lined up on the side of the bridge. Here are the soldiers come marching over the bridge. Hitler's troops received quite a warm welcome, as you can see here. And the Western powers didn't do anything about this. France, England, the United States, everybody was kind of like, oh, well, you know, Germany's been behaving and it's been a lot of years since Versailles. And there was a lot of talk starting in 1936 amongst the diplomats of the Western countries. You know, maybe the terms of the treaty were a little bit harsh. The Rhineland is part of Germany, and maybe, you know, it's just fine if Hitler is going to remilitarize it, okay, kind of remove this status of the demilitarized zone from the Rhineland. So there was no response from the Western powers. Now this is important, okay, because everything that happens that starts to happen is a direct or an indirect violation of the terms established under the Treaty of Versailles. And what the fascist leaders are doing right here is they're pushing, and they're seeing what kind of pushback they get. Many historians think that in 1936, if England, France, or the United States had chosen to put a foot down and stop the fascist aggression, that would have been very effective. That Hitler, who was building up, really rebuilding the German military, he hadn't rebuilt it to a point yet where they could have effectively fought back against a Western invasion or military operation. But that wasn't the response that Hitler received. This was getting past the worst years of the Great Depression. These countries were all very inward looking at this time, and nobody was eager to rush into armed confrontation again. There was a lot of hope. So, well, the Rhineland's part of Germany. Maybe, hopefully, this is all going to be fine. Hitler, as a young man, and especially as a veteran of the First World War, had really been inspired by an ideology of pan-Germanism. Pan-Germanism, pan meaning all. That's a word that means all when it's put in front of another word, in front of an ism. And so pan-Germanism, or pan whatever, is extremely nationalistic. It's an extremely nationalistic world view. And so pan-Germanism means all Germans together. And so Hitler's vision of Germany was not Bismarck's vision of Germany. Bismarck's vision of Germany was Little Germany, Germany without Austria. Hitler was Austrian by birth. He was a disciple of pan-Germanism. His vision of Germany was all Germany, and would have included all German-speaking areas. So this is a hugely simplified map, but it shows you what Hitler is thinking here. Pan-Germanism. Germany, the Rhineland, which he had taken back over by 1936, and Austria. The Treaty of Versailles formally forbade Germany and Austria to unify, formally forbade them from unifying. But in 1938, I believe, sometime after the Rhineland, 1937 or 1938, the German government, under Hitler's direction, ordered a plebiscite in Austria that was called the Anschluss. And the Anschluss was a plebiscite on whether or not the Austrians wanted to become part of Germany. Now, if you are a fan of the Sound of Music, like I am, the Anschluss is the political issue that is underlying the entire plot of that movie. The admiral, the captain, von Trapp, he is against it. He does not want Austria to become part of Germany. He does not want to be drafted into the service of the Nazi Empire. But you remember Liesel's little boyfriend who joins the Germans, and Max, Uncle Max, who just, wants to do the most expedient thing. The Anschluss is the issue at the heart of that story. And the Anschluss is what happens when the captain and Maria are gone on their honeymoon and they come back and all the Nazi flags are flying in Austria. And it was simply, it's a plebiscite, was a yes or no vote. Do you want to be part of this great new German Reich, this great new German empire? And the Austrians said yes, they do. Now, again, this was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but the Western powers said, oh, well, the Austrians chose this. They voted on it. I guess it's okay. Again, there was no response to these actions. And in the wake of the Anschluss, Hitler became more emboldened. He very publicly and very loudly talked about the unification of all German-speaking people into one Germany. And so after the Anschluss, he had Austria, which of course is right here. And so in September of 1938, Hitler used his army to invade an area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland is this little white area of Czechoslovakia that you see kind of around its southern and western and northern borders right there. The Sudetenland was about a 50-50 German-speaking population. It's a border area. Please remember that Czechoslovakia was part of the old Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire. And so Czechoslovakia, like Poland, was a new country in the aftermath of World War I. It had been carved out of the map of Europe as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And so this isn't an Anschluss, and this isn't remilitarizing a demilitarized zone. This is the occupation of the Sudetenland by the Nazi armies. And so this actually did prompt a little bit of an international crisis. I love this picture. If we were having live class, I would ask you all, do you think this woman is crying for sadness or for joy? I have no idea, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, it just so happened that the Sudetenland was where most of Czechoslovakia's industrial and mining capacity was located. How convenient for the German Führer. And this did provoke, this is an outright occupation. The Czech territory had never been part of Germany. It had always been part of Austria's army. You have to go all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire to reestablish the German connection. And this was blatantly aggressive. Okay, Hitler's excuse was that the Sudetenland had German-speaking people. Well, it did. It had some. It was a border region. Okay, it was kind of like Alsace-Lorraine. It wasn't fully Czech and it wasn't fully German, but it had always been part of the Habsburg territories, never part of the German Empire. Well, the world condemned this, and there was a bit of an international kerfluffle over it. And in order to settle things, there was international conference that was held in Munich at Hitler's retreat, the Eagle's Nest, that was held there in September of 1938. And this was called the Munich Conference. And the men that you see here, the man on the far left is Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. Here's Neville, and then here's Hitler. And over on this side, you have the Czech president and then the president of France, Leon Blum. And essentially what was decided here was that the Western powers were not going to intervene at this time. You notice the United States isn't there. They said this was Europe's problem. They weren't all that interested in it. And they were going to let them figure it out. And so this is at Hitler's home turf, in his house. This is not a neutral site or anything. And nobody cared, really, honestly, nobody cared what the Czechs wanted or what the Czechs thought about all of this. And so a deal was struck in Munich at the Munich conference between Chamberlain and Hitler. This was their deal. The French went along with it. And the deal was that Hitler would stop. The Western powers would not intervene. They would not respond, but Hitler was done. He was going to knock this off. And Hitler said, sure, I've reunited all my German-speaking people now. I'm good. And so they shook on it. This is called appeasement. And this is the great diplomatic program or policy of appeasement. And this particular time, appeasement, of course, we know the history went dreadfully wrong, but it's something that's pretty widely practiced in diplomacy in particular and life in general. Appeasement is giving somebody what they want in the hopes that they will shut up, quit, be happy, however you want to look at it. So like when you were a kid and you were at the store and you wanted a candy bar and your mom said no, and you pitched a fit, and then she bought you the candy bar so you will shut up, that is appeasement. And so this is appeasement on the international scale. The British said, all right, you can have the Sudetenland, but you need to stop. Hitler said, absolutely, I'm good, I'm done, thank you so much. Neville Chamberlain returned home to England in September of 1938 to a hero's welcome. He said very boldly he had secured peace in our time. Again, nobody wants to go back to war. Nobody wants to go back to war. And Chamberlain was widely viewed as a hero. He took the Munich Agreement to Parliament for their confirmation vote, if you will. That was a symbolic thing. The deal was, final. But he goes ahead and just for a show of support, lets Parliament vote on it. And every member of Parliament voted in favor of the Munich Agreement except for one. And the one person, the only member of Parliament to vote against it, was a man named Winston Churchill, who of course would go on to become the Prime Minister of England in 1940 when England was in fact embroiled in war with Germany. And I love Winston Churchill. I think he's a super interesting guy. And he very famously said upon his no vote, the appeaser is the one who feeds the crocodile in the hope that it will eat him last. It's one of the things I love about Winston Churchill. He just had a way with words. Well, why was everyone being so lenient with Adolf Hitler and Mussolini to a lesser extent, who, by the way, in the midst of all this, had formed a formal defensive alliance between themselves and the fascist emperor of Japan called the Triple Axis? One of the reasons was because nobody wanted to go back to war. So wishful thinking, head in the sand, whatever you want to call it. The other reason, and this one was a little bit more practical, was because there was Joseph Stalin over to Hitler's east. And really, with very good reason, fascism and communism were so politically opposed that to the British and the French and others, they really thought if Hitler got too aggressive and too out of line, Joseph Stalin would put his foot down and would stop him. So Joseph Stalin was seen as the emergency brake, if you will. He was seen as the buffer. And so wasn't the world surprised that when in August of 1939, the world became aware of a secret deal that had been concluded between the Nazis and the Soviets, this non-aggression pact, as it was called. Y'all, I need to back up a little bit, forgive me, in the timeline. In March of 1939, Hitler invaded and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Whoops, okay, Chamberlain looked really bad. And now it was in March of 1939 that everyone really kind of started to, they weren't rushing into war this time like they did in World War I, but understand that it was coming. So that was in March of 1939. But what's their last bastion of hope? What are they holding out for? Joseph Stalin. And so in August of 1939, when it became known that back earlier in the summer, Hitler and Stalin had secretly concluded a non-aggression pact, this was the punch in the gut to England, to France, and to the United States and the other Western powers. The oh no, except they didn't say no. War is coming. They knew it. The non-aggression pact was simply that. It was a non-aggression pact. It was not a defensive alliance. It was a pact not to invade each other, not to go to war with each other. The details essentially were this. Hitler was going to invade Poland, and Joseph Stalin wasn't going to stop him. And in exchange for Stalin not stopping Hitler's invasion of Poland, Hitler would give half of the Polish territory to the Russian dictator, and then he would turn his attention to the West. And so they're partitioning Poland again. And so this happened in the middle of August. Everyone's like, oh no. England and France start preparing for war. The United States starts preparing to do everything in their power to stay out of the war. And then on September 1st, 1939, German troops invaded Poland in a first act of what was known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. You hit hard, you hit fast. You take down the important defenses. So if you're familiar with football and the blitz play in football when everybody goes after the quarterback. The Blitzkrieg War, the Lightning War, September 1st, 1939. The Poles actually fought back bravely and they lasted about 3 weeks, but the outcome of this invasion was never in question. The outcome of it was never in question. The Poles were defeated from the get-go. In response to Germany's invasion of Poland, England and France declared war on Germany, and World War II had started. You can see here the bombing of structures in Poland, giving cover to the soldiers on the ground, and the tanks going roaring into Poland, flying the Nazi flag. World War II was on.